An enormous welcome to everybody on behalf of the APGRD to this term's speaker series. I'm sorry we can't be actually welcoming you to the classics faculty, but we are absolutely delighted to have you with us virtually. Our guest today is the renowned British director and writer Tom Morris. Tom is currently Artistic Director of Bristol Old Vic, Associate Director of the National Theatre, and a prolific maker of work, including co-directing Warhorse and more recently the incredible Grinning Man and Into the Void. We're here today to chat to Tom about Orpheus in the Underworld at ENO. It was part of their 2019 Orpheus season, which featured 4 new reimaginings of the Orpheus myth. This particular production was directed by Emma Rice, and it was a new version of Offenbach's 1858 operetta, for which Tom wrote new lyrics and a new libretto. So the first thing I'd really like to ask Tom is, how did this project come about? I know you directed for ENO before, but how did this particular project involve you?
Well, Emma Rice is one of my sort of most profound influences in theatre making, really. And I worked with her on a couple of shows when she was directing shows for Knee High. And have remained really in close contact with her ever since. We also worked together on an adaptation of the Powell and Pressburger film, A Matter of Life and Death, at the National Theatre. And when she had a sort of torrid time when she was being her own brilliant version of the artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe. And as she was trying to work out what she was going to do next, she was invited to do an opera, direct an opera which she hadn't done before. And because I'd written lyrics for some of those Knee High shows for a play called The Wooden Frock and an adaptation of Angela Carter's Nights at the Circus, she said, would you like to write the lyrics for this reworking of this operetta? And I had been writing lyrics on The Grinning Man and got quite excited about that. So just said yes. Great collaborator, very exciting score, the opportunity to think about it in a different way, and something to distract me from the endless nightmare of trying to run a theatre.
Can I ask you about the nitty-gritty of adapting it? So quite a lot of the people working, academics working at the APGRD, are looking at this process of translation or adaptation. What were you actually working from as source material? Were you working from the French, from lots of different versions, from another translation? What was your source text? Yeah,
very good. So the French text, the score, obviously, hugely important. Other versions of the story. I mean, weirdly, I'd been working on a production of Monteverdi's version of the story, which is very different, and which had got cancelled, which is now, I think it's now going to happen in 2022 or something, which was a bit of a rewrite and directing. For me, it's one of the myths that I keep coming back to. The root of it for me is the very short Ovid version, in which there is a detail when Orpheus goes to hell. There's this amazing thing where he sings in hell, and Ovid says when he's singing, Tantalus, who's there, he keeps leaning down to drink his water and reaching up to eat his grapes, and he forgets about the water and he forgets about the grapes. And Sisyphus is rolling his stone up and down the hill, and he stops and forgets he's supposed to roll his stone up and down the hill. And Prometheus, who's having his liver eaten out by an eagle, forgets that he's having his liver eaten out by an eagle, because the music is so amazing. And for me, that's always the route into the myth in whatever version. And in terms of the process, we started out doing story bashing, which is really how Emma and I worked on when we were when we were making shows at Knee High. As we got the score, we got a libretto. The score is essentially like a musical sketchbook. You can kind of take it or leave it. There's about 4.5 hours of music from the various different versions that were done. We roughly based it around the shorter original version with a couple of bits from some of the rewrites. But the key thing was, what was the story we were trying to tell, and how, and could we manage to do that while genuinely serving the music? And this is a riddle. Interrupt me if I'm talking too much, but so the original, the Offenbach original, is a satire. So he's saying, you all know the story about Orpheus and how it's about love and all of that stuff. Wouldn't it be great if they didn't actually love each other at all? Let's satirize the whole idea of the reverence that we have for these classical stories. And in a way, his topic was a kind of rebellion against a sort of literary and poetic orthodoxy, which he was perceiving in the world he was living in. Our view at the start was that the idea of, and this might be entirely wrong, but the idea of rebelling against a classical orthodoxy wasn't really as pressing a topic for us now, when the audiences we were trying to engage were people who might have never been to an opera before, as it was for him when he was creating a cabaret entertainment in a very different time and culture. And for us to be saying, no, this really is a story for you, even if you don't know that you might like opera. And by the way, it's about our relationship with classical source texts. We'd immediately have lost all of our audience before they even came in. And also because both Emma Rice and I are, while obviously being highly disciplined artists, essentially a bit cheesy. We weren't really satisfied with the idea of a love story that was purely satirized. We wanted, a more postmodernist pair of collaborators might have been happy just to pick that apart entirely, as Offenbach did. But we wanted to believe that there was some sort of emotional root to the relationship between Orpheus and Eurydice, and actually in the score, I kind of think there is. It's almost as if Offenbach is having it both ways in a different way, because he seems to be satirizing the relationship, but lots of the music is incredibly emotionally compelling. We did a couple of cheats. So he quotes Gluck's score, and when he does that, he sort of really is taking the piss. But in our version, we tried to make it as if he was, which I think he also was, a bit in love with that source, because he kind of spills it out into his own version anyway, and to invest in that emotionally. So in other words, we were almost reconstructing the classical route that he deconstructed in order to make something that would feel emotionally coherent to a modern audience. That was the plan, at least, while hopefully cracking a few jokes and being irreverent at the same time.
And when you talk about the audience, I think it's really interesting who you were trying to reach with it, because that wasn't necessarily, sometimes an opera audience, you would expect them to know all the different versions of an opera, and therefore you are riffing off other productions. But I know that you were trying to reach a much wider audience than might already be an audience for your and Emma's work. Can you tell us a little bit about that in terms of just how you were trying to make the work accessible to that broader demographic than perhaps we might think of as conventional opera goers?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is almost certainly wrong, but I think there are only 2 directors working in Britain who actually sell tickets for the shows they direct, and they are Simon McBurney and Emma Rice. and Emma Rice sells more, basically. So, you know, the experience that she'd had at Shakespeare's Globe was, while all the internal structures at Shakespeare's Globe were getting themselves into an absolute kind of agony of obsessive pseudo-sourcism about the things that she was doing, she smashed all of the box office records for that season that she did there, because lots of, quotes, ordinary people really like her work and don't find it intimidating and find it genuinely entertaining and genuinely thought-provoking. So I think that what Daniel Kramer was doing when he was inviting Emma to stage this was trying to get her audience to go to an opera or an operetta. I mean, we should be clear about that, it's an operetta, or at least go in through the doors of the English National Opera. And my job was to go with her on that journey and make sure that because absolutely nobody's going to go to the go see an opera on the basis of who's doing the libretto. Least of all of it is me. So my job was to serve and collaborate with her kind of creative draw and her relationship with her audience, and try and make sure that if her audience decided to take a risk and go into the doors of the English National Opera, the Colosseum, they would at least find something they could understand.
I think it's got a really interesting relationship to classics, that, because actually for those of us who are really passionate about these stories, or trying to make sure that the way we present them to new audiences is an invitation and not a barrier, that we make people feel that they can fall in love with these stories, but that a prior knowledge of them is not a gateway to enjoying the work. I think there's a lot that we can take as classicists from thinking in that way of going, actually, how do we empower people to enjoy this material rather than make them feel stupid if they don't get all the references.
Yeah, I remember a very short conversation with my dad, who he was a doctor, but he did love classics, in which I said to him, "The Frogs, that's a funny play, isn't it? You could almost tell that story to anyone." And he said, "Yes, Grekekekex, coax, coax." I said, no, that's really not helping. That's really like just when you need to make the invitation, you're suddenly creating a barrier.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes people who love classics inadvertently put the barrier where they mean to put the invitation.
And this whole season really was about an invitation, because it's quite bold to program 4 different artistic responses to the same myth or to the same story. Were the artistic teams aware of what each other were doing at all in that? Or, you know, because obviously we've got these multiple Orpheus commissions happening at the same time. Were you all aware of what each other were doing, or was there no engagement between the teams?
There was some, because there was overlap in the design teams. I have to say I wasn't part of that. I mean, one of the challenges for me on this project was that I said, yes, I'll absolutely do it. But I was in rehearsal for something else at the same time. In fact, 2 other things, one after another. And normally when I work with Emma, or previously, I was in the rehearsal room all of the time, and we were reshaping the work we were doing depending on what we found out in the rehearsal room. I just couldn't do that. I had to do all of this remotely. And anyway, there are challenges in the practice of opera rehearsal, and particularly big opera houses rehearsal process, which meant that she couldn't do that anyway very easily herself. So there was some crossover between creative teams, not a huge amount, I think, but certainly in the design teams there was, because it had to be compatible. But sadly, I wasn't able to join in with that.
And in terms of the sort of centrality of this myth, because it's quite fun to say, look, to audiences, look, there are all these different ways we can go with this myth. There's no right way to tell this story. You've said that right at the heart of it is the moment in Ovid when he has the most amazing voice that it can stop anything, which is kind of a parallel for the kind of art we all want to make, you know, the piece of art that makes even the man having his liver eaten stop in his tracks. But once you started working on it, what was it about the Orpheus story that you really wanted to communicate to a modern audience? Why do we keep telling this story?
I guess I wanted to tell a love story, but just this particular, a love story that works with and engages with Offenbach's response to this myth, which is not a love story. So, but I think has a kind of subtext of a love story. And there is something, again, the particular job of writing a libretto to an existing score is kind of a bit like coloring in, really. You sort of, you've got the melodic shape. So there's a lot of just basic jigsaw work that you've got to do in order to try and find a line that is going to have its meaning released by the melodic shape that the composer has given you. And I think trying to join the dots between a love story that felt compelling and had sort of hot points, which are there in the Offenbach version, which particularly, I think he does articulate despair very eloquently in the score, and the bit where Eurydice wants to die. That was the first bit I worked on lyrically, because it felt that the Gibbon store, that his insight that she might actually want to die, that's an intervention. Obviously, in Ovid or in any of the previous, she really doesn't want to die. So that's then we've got to work out why she wants to die in our story. And Emma was very clear that she wanted her to die because she was dealing with some serious shit, rather than because she just hated her husband, which is what the Offenbach sort of posits. But so I guess what I'm saying is you can't have too grand a theory when you're trying to join so many dots and trying to be true to the source material while having a bit of a take on it as well. So
one thing that really impressed me was how contemporary a lot of the diction actually is, and how natural a lot of the text feels, and therefore how intentionally or unintentionally so politically interesting it is. I'm thinking about I've got a line here. It's the only dance that knows he won't forget while he's plotting to achieve non-consensual sex. And that phrase, non-consensual sex, sort of singing out of the text, puts it in a really modern political context, talking about issues of consent, while still really marrying with the music. And I wondered how much that developed as you wrote, or how much your intention going in was to try and get this really modern discourse marrying up with the original music.
Yeah, so we did talk about that. You know, there's one big chorus which goes da-da, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da, and goes on like that. And it's basically the gods rebelling against Jupiter. And in the setting it goes enough, which is, you know, that sits with that rhythm. And then what we do with the rest of the line essentially goes, your time is up, Jupiter, in different ways. And obviously at that point, in relation to the Me Too movement, that phrase, your time is up, was alive when we were talking about it. And Jupiter is, you know, mythologically a rapist. Essentially, he's the ideological source for the justification of rape and sexual abuse. And he's very, very heavily embedded in our culture. So to connect the rebellion of the gods in this kind of silly plot with something that felt alive politically now, just felt obvious, really. I mean, you can't sort of pretend. I don't want to work on an opera which is based on an assumption of irrelevance.
Yeah.
I'd much rather try and make the assumption one of relevance and then see where we can go with it.
I think it was really exciting to see Emma's sort of ability to really make the sort of victimization of Eurydice really visual, the idea of the sort of gaze on her. And it reminded me of the fact that we've been really lucky to have quite a few sort of really interesting sort of female interpretations of that story. It reminded me of Sarah Rule's version of the story, and the idea of in some ways finding voice, not just literally but also visually, for these sort of female characters. That, because when we actually tell those myths, it's a really interesting pedagogic question how we tell Greek myths now to small children, because do we just gloss over all the rapes that happen, and do we just make it sound rather beautiful that, you know, Zeus slept with someone and she turned into a swan, you know, or do we actually grapple with what that is? And I think the production didn't shy away from any of those questions out of how difficult our relationship has to be with those myths, because of the just unbelievably casual nature with which rape is absolutely at the heart of pretty much all Greek myths that we tell. But it felt like the production didn't duck that. I'm going to open up to all the brilliant students in the room now to ask if anyone's got questions. I know that Eleanor is in the room and she had a really, really interesting question about the character of public opinion. So I might just put her on the spot and ask if she might kick us off with that question. Is that all right, Eleanor?
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, thank you so much for the discussion. That was really interesting. I was just wondering, I was really interested in the role of public opinion in the opera, and how the adaptation of a role got to be in the operetta and in the Anna production, and especially considering the casting of Lucia Lucas in the role of public opinion. So yeah, whatever you've got to say about that.
Yeah, sure. So public opinion is the narrator in the original version of the operetta, and dramaturgically the idea is that people are only interested in reputation and what things look like, and so public opinion has got a power in the story because of that. But even in the original, when it was written, I don't think that that through line is amazingly satisfying. And the phrase public opinion now, it means something different. It's a lot more to do with kind of polling and directions of political thought, and the kinds of things that are manipulated by Donald Trump, or pick your politician, Dominic Cummings, whoever you want, rather than a sort of overwhelming and inflexible kind of force which people get deluded by. I mean, I know that there are some ways you could have, the root of that idea, we could have taken in all sorts of different directions. And then Emma said she had this idea of public opinion driving around in a taxi. Okay. Where do we go with that? And I actually wanted to change, when she said that, I wanted to change the name of public opinion to The Knowledge, so that there was a sort of taxi joke going on, and some of that is in the libretto, but essentially the story of fear of what people might think is sort of, while it is politically alive, it's sketchy in the original and sort of started to fall away from the story we were trying to tell. In other words, in the dynamic that we were just talking about, when we were saying, well, what are the gods actually rebelling about? Is it just a silly rebellion, which is a series of jokes that we don't care about? Well, no, it isn't really, because we've got this classical root of misogyny and rape, and you can't be entirely silly about that. That does connect with an idea of public opinion, which doesn't really connect with the character who's called public opinion. So we sort of went in a slightly different direction with that character. And in terms of the trans identity of the artist playing the role, it was very interesting that she is not precious about the identity the identity of the characters she's playing. So we thought about whether there was a way, whether there was a through line for this taxi driving public opinion character, whether there was a through line which could actually culminate in a transition. And in the end, the story is so chaotic at the end that we thought there wasn't, and she was entirely happy just to play a male character, which is where we ended up. So we ended up concentrating on this idea of someone who is essentially an enabler, who is not supposed to who's not supposed to interfere with the plot, but sort of does, because they can see more of the truths of what's really going on for the characters than they're prepared to admit.
I was just following up from that. Did the at what stage was the casting in that journey? The casting was before the role.
Yeah, before. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
this is the way opera houses work.
Yeah, the
casting was like way out. So I was also going, right, who have you got? What are the another bit of the jigsaw, which is not how I would ideally work, but it's also fair to say that English National Opera has had a bit of a turbulent time over the last, some might say 50 years, but certainly the last 5 years, and that meant that there was a little bit of chaos around the process, which you know, we tried to use opportunistically rather than see it as an obstacle.
Alex has a question that coming up next, I think. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. And a more general question, sort of going back to Eleonora's question, also the discussion before. So you mentioned like the incongruity in Offenbach's version between like the text that's quite humorous and like the music that's quite romantic and sentimental at points, and how your libretto is in a way closer to like what can be sensed in the music than what the libretto is saying sometimes. So I was wondering if there was ever the possibility of having a new score to go with the libretto, and if not, why the decision to just change the words and not the music? Like, did you feel that the music is more enduring than the words? Like, for example, going to Helen's mention of consensual sex that is in the new libretto, and to what an extent do you feel you can push this disconnect between very modern words and the original music, especially like in opera where usually you associate a score with like the original words that go with it?
Yeah, it's a good question. The first layer of answer is that it's just the nature of the gig. So I was asked to write the words, no one was asked to rewrite the music. But secondly, I do think that the music is weirdly compelling emotionally. So there was something quite exciting about trying to let it speak. The music also, you know, in the can. I don't know whether it's useful to look at the libretto here, but you can if you want to. The can, which is the most famous bit of music. The original libretto is kind of silly and a bit joyful. And Emma, whose breakthrough production for Knee High was a version of the Red Shoes, saw the can as a kind of furious rebellion, which hopefully traveled a journey from humor to absurdity to bitter anger. The reason I was excited about the job is because the music's really, I mean, music is like a sort of emotional current for me, and being able to immerse myself in it and try and find ways of articulating what I can feel in those currents is incredibly exciting. Of course, it's equally exciting, in some ways more exciting or differently exciting, if on something like The Grinning Man, I can sometimes just write some lyrics, and then Tim Phillips and Mark Tytler just go away and come back and say, we think we can hear this in your lyrics. But that just wasn't the gig here.
I think the next question is coming from Zoe.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. So I actually went to see all 4 of these because the first chapter of my thesis is on receptions of Ovid in performance, and the first chapter is on Orpheus. So I really enjoyed hearing you speak, thank you. So I just wanted to go back to what Helen said earlier about the kind of visual nature of especially your focus on non-consensual sex, and I wondered if you would be able to speak a little bit about the scene with the fly. Yeah, because I remember I was in the audience and I was surrounded by children, and everyone was in fits of laughter, and it was a very kind of, you had to kind of check yourself and think, actually, what is it's funny what's going on the stage, but we are watching what is a rape, and it's very, like, the dramatic irony in that moment is incredibly high, because of course Eurydice, I think, doesn't know that the fly is Jupiter. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, and of course you have, I think in that moment you have on the stage the peep show, sort of inset stage, and I wondered if you could speak a little bit about you kind of playing with the gaze there a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm not trying to dodge it, but the kind of peep show setup is that's Emma's intervention, which she should really talk about, not me. But the question you raise in relation to the libretto is really interesting. So the setup here is that the gods, and this is in the original, the gods have said essentially to Jupiter, you keep changing yourself into other creatures in order to rape women. And certainly in our version, they end up saying that is the motivation for them rebelling, which it isn't quite in the original. We changed the order of that. Then Jupiter goes to find Eurydice in hell, and he turns himself into a fly in order to seduce her, because so he can get into the room she's locked up in. So you've got a whole lot of really unstable kind of dramatizations of an oppressive power relationship on top of each other. But the music is funny. So you sort of, you can't be po-faced in the libretto. And there is, so essentially in the libretto, most of what I did was try and articulate the music and deliver the absurdity of the story. But I did introduce some things which are not in the original, which is that in this case, Jupiter's in danger of being squashed. So the power relationship is at least partly offset by the particular disguise that he's chosen, which just gave Eurydice a little bit more to play with and a little bit more agency than there is in the original. There is a dangerous instability in it, which is just there, which is the idea of actually a fly and a human having sex is essentially comic rather than political. But that was a kind of unavoidable strut of the plot. But in setting it, I was trying at least to open out a little bit more ambiguity than there is in the source.
In one of the reviews that I was reading of it, they quoted the lines, "When I wiggle my bum, my little wings begin to hum," that he was singing, and how complex that moment was, because on the one hand, the sort of puppetry, the joy, the music, and yet an actor who was sort of old enough to be her grandfather While we're just on insects momentarily, the Song of the Bees, the Ghost of All the Bees that Eurydice didn't see, and maybe it's just because I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about bees in an environmental context. Those ghosts of all the bees she didn't look after, was there anything environmental in that, or did I just read that in because I'm worrying about all the bees we don't look after?
Well, no, there is something environmental in that, but it's that's not. I mean, they're not bees in the the original.
Yeah. No, I just wondered if you'd threaded that through.
Yeah, I did. And it's really because there's a sort of unplaced, incredibly beautiful, mournful melody, and I guess I was interested in the idea of what she, in her emotional distress, was or wasn't attending to, and also the idea. So she's essentially having escapist sex with someone who she thinks is a shepherd, who's a beekeeper, and obviously she's got her own stuff going on, so she's not really thinking about bees, except in a sort of innuendo sense. And then, so articulating this mournful melody, which comes at the point where she's beginning to re-examine the story she's experienced, and herself. And actually, I really can't remember what the hell's happening in Offenbach's version. But what we ended up with was the ghosts of the bees, who she's never even thought of, come back to her and say, look, you are in danger here as well. You've got to watch out. You're the subject of, you're still being hunted here. And they give this warning, which is therefore the kind of perfect gift, because she hasn't minded them at all, but they're still minding her. And, you know, I'm not going to hang an ecological manifesto on that, but there is at least a hint of that in it.
So yeah, there's something still looking after us even when we're ignoring it.
Yeah, there's a profound generosity in nature, which is sort of unstoppable, whatever we do, if we only bloody listen to it.
Estelle's got her hand up. Over to you, Estelle.
Thank you. I'd like to know a little bit more about your collaboration with Emma Rice and the rest of the designers on this production. So you said you haven't been attending rehearsals, but I'd like to know more about the discussion you had with them before the writing, during the writing, and after the writing, because from what you said and what I've seen, the notes that are in the librettos, I'm tempted to say that you've been like the dramaturg in some ways for this production. Would you agree on that?
Well, I guess yes, in some ways, yes, that is what I was doing. Although the fact that I wasn't able to be there in rehearsals meant I wasn't able to, there were some times when I would have liked to do that and I wasn't able to. So what happened in rehearsals is I'd have a catch up with Emma and she'd say, this singer is asking questions about this moment, and can you think about, can the libretto help unlock something? And I'd make a suggestion, or she'd say, the singer has suggested we tweak this to help this through line. Like we had quite a lot of discussion about the moment when public opinion persuades Orpheus to actually go to Olympus and fight for his marriage. I mean, that's at best a sort of dodgy point in the plot of the original. So that was something that the rehearsal room absolutely fed into. And I just wish I could have been there, because that's the way I would normally work with Emma, but I couldn't. I was rehearsing a different opera.
Do you think, because the question before about about is the music is somehow more sort of sacred than the text. Does the need to translate operas often just because of the need to translate them for performance mean that we're just much more used to shifting text than we are to shifting music? I mean, is that just a feature of because we often translate operas to perform them in different countries, are we just much more used to messing with the text than messing with the music?
Yes, I'm going to answer this through a mask while I'm on the move, because otherwise I'm going to run out of battery. Okay, so don't be upset by that.
Are we going to get some more glimpses of your COVID preparations at the theatre, as you know, because we're enjoying glimpsing. Tom is at Bristol, where they are currently socially distancing the foyer to use as a performance space because it is more secure than the main house, and we're getting a little sneak of that, though he may have just lost broadband.
So basically, I'm not an opera historian, but essentially, certainly since Wagner and probably since Mozart, and in fact, probably since Monteverdi, opera is essentially a musical dramatic form. It means that the composer is the dramatist. If I'm working on opera, which I try not to do more than one every 2 years, because it's a difficult industry to work in, I don't know. But when I'm doing that, I'm essentially trying to release the drama that's in the music. So, and sometimes the libretto gets in the way of that. So I did a production of the John Adams opera called The Death of Klinghoffer, which is, and he's an incredibly dramatic composer. There's a huge amount of conflict in his music. And the libretto for that is by Alice Goodman. She's a poet whose words are sometimes pretty reluctant to release their meanings, and certainly not in the timescale of a singer singing them. So in that case, I was trying to persuade her to change her words, the words that she'd written, rather than him to change his music, just because that seems the right way to do it. You know, the the biggest excitement would be to be working on a new opera where you could actually be doing those things at the same time. But once the score has kind of crystallized, you sort of have to work with that as the dramatic structure, I think.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question about how what the role of perhaps diminished role of words can be in that rehearsal room, and whether that's right or wrong, I'm not getting into, but I think it's definitely a fact that there's a sort of primacy given to music over text in that rehearsal culture, perhaps.
I mean, it was quite. I did I also worked recently on an opera where both the composer and the librettist were alive, which was an adaptation of a film called Breaking the Waves, and in that case, I was quite nervous about doing it at all, and only did it after I'd had a long conversation with the composer about what she was trying to release in the story through the score. And in that conversation, I did ask her to think about changing some bits of the score, which she did. And I then, I did ask the librettist to change a few lines as well to help the drama. But I only did that by trying to find out what the composer was, what her essential take, what she was trying to release might be, and then asked some questions about ways in which I thought we could do that more.
With this particular project, in terms of releasing Offenbach's intention. There's definitely a sense in which you were capturing that sort of spirit of satire. I loved, I was reading a sort of historical review of it, and it was really not very well received until word got around that it was really quite naughty and satirical and verging on obscene, and then suddenly everyone was very excited about it. Definitely it was an act of provocation, which I think was something that, you know, that spirit of his willingness to satirize sources, his willingness to sort of metatextually place himself in that tradition was sort of singing through the version. I think Marcus had his hand up. Marcus, have you got a question?
Yeah, that's okay. I was kind of wondering about that kind of provocative thing that Offenbach was doing, because we've talked about the Gluck and the love story and that, and like Gluck added a happy ending into his Orpheus and Eurydice. I think like he made them, the lovers, you know, Eurydice comes back to life and they get to end up happily ever after. But Offenbach is refusing that. And I imagine when you're saying that, like, because it's Jupiter who casts a spell or throws a lightning bolt, so Orpheus turns around and Eurydice ends up trapped back in the underworld with him. I was wondering, because Offenbach was kind of doing this response to Gluck, if you ever thought, or you were trying to find a way, guess I'm asking, did you felt like you found a way to give Eurydice a kind of satisfyingly, you know, resistant or kind of triumphant or satirical ending in the context of Me Too, and given that Jupiter is this, you know, kind of powerful.
Yeah. Very, very good question. So Offenbach's joke is that essentially at the end of the opera, she doesn't have to go back with Orpheus, and she kind of goes, thank God for that, I can just do the can instead. In the sort of moral world that Emma was setting up, that wasn't a satisfactory conclusion. So the story that she was pursuing, and I was pursuing too, therefore, was that there was a moment that essentially Eurydice realizes that even though Orpheus is incredibly vain and exhibits all kinds of quintessentially masculine weaknesses of self-obsession, shallow vanity, and etc. And that nonetheless, there is a kind of delight in their relationship, which she wants to recapture. So she kind of accepts his flaws, and then therefore when she loses him again, that's bad for her, and therefore the can is a sort of dance of despair, almost a dance of death at the end. One of the things which I think is there in the score and in the libretto, which I would have been pushing a bit more if I'd have been in the rehearsal room, is the power within that rebellion. That the last note of the piece that I think Emma and I were trying to write was that, yes, she's lost she's lost even her flawed male partner, and yes, she's still, her life is circumscribed by these kind of predatory male forces, but somehow in her own body there is an uncrushable rebellion and an uncrushable energy which isn't dead yet. So and I don't think that the production quite achieved that balance, but I think it is, if we were doing it again, that's what I'd be trying to get.
I'd like to know what's your experience with choruses, specifically in opera, both in writing and directing, And specifically when it comes to ancient materials, ancient myths, did you spot any similarities with choruses in theater and specifically in ancient theaters, or is it totally different from your point of view?
Yeah, good. So I'm not a classical scholar in any way, so I'm probably going to commit a whole lot of schoolboy errors in what I say. But the interesting thing about opera is that the chorus is predominantly musical. Missy Mazzoli, who wrote Breaking the Waves, actually saw Death of Klinghoffer at the Met and thought, oh, great, I'm going to use a musical chorus like John Adams used in Breaking the Waves, weirdly. In Death of Klinghoffer, the chorus sits as a musical unit and then inhabits a whole lot of different dramatic functions. So in the edit of Death of Klinghoffer that we've ended up with, which actually involves a scene being cut from the original version, it opens with two choruses, one of exiled Palestinians and one of exiled Jewish people, Israelis. And essentially it's the same group of performers who are playing, if you like, opposite perspectives. And he's working musically with variations of a musical language to inhabit opposite perspectives. In Missy Mazzoli's version of Breaking the Waves, there's a chorus who are sometimes village elders, sometimes oil rig workers, and sometimes a kind of imagined voice of God in the kind of deluded head of the protagonist. And the same musical sound is therefore shaped to do these different dramaturgical jobs. And that is a characteristic of operatic chorus. So your job, if you're staging it, or to an extent if you're writing a libretto, is to try to work out what dramatic use you can make of that. How is it dramatically interesting that the gods might sound a bit like the ghosts of the bees, for example. So you've got that to play with. Now, my understanding of Greek drama is that the chorus is more rooted in character. In other words, there's a more coherent connection with some kind of communal voice. The people whose society is being ripped by what the protagonists are doing. And so even though they're a collective voice, you kind of know who they are all the way through. But I might be wrong about that. But I think that makes quite a big difference, even though emotionally, the musical characteristics of the way that the chorus sing might give you something that feels a bit like that. Dramaturgically, it's different.
Thank you, Tom. I know we have to let you go, but I think it just opened a brilliant can of worms there, and perhaps there's another entire day of discussion about the chorus in opera in relation to the Greek chorus that I would love to have, because it feels like we're at the beginning of a really interesting possible discussion there. Thank you. Thanks for taking us in the middle of trying to get a theatre reopened, trying
Not
to
at all.
COVID-proof a building, everything else. It's really, really, really appreciated. And thank you to the students. I'm going to wave at you all.
Yeah, nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Today. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.